Good afternoon, and thank you all for braving the second coldest day of the season. It is nice and warm in here. I'm Barbara Bodine, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at the Edmonds Walsh School of Foreign Service, right over there. Founded in 1978, the Institute's mission is to bring together diplomats, other practitioners, scholars, and students from across and beyond Georgetown University to explore a wide range of global challenges and the evolving demands of diplomatic statecraft. The purpose is to better understand the nexus between theory and practice, between the scholar and the practitioner, and to enhance and expand an appreciation of the critical role of diplomacy as a national security tool in both as formulation and implementation. The Institute hosts a number of events and lectures throughout the academic year, including the very prestigious Oscar Iden Lecture in American Foreign Policy and Diplomacy. Begun in 1976, so it actually predates the Institute, these lectures commemorate the late Mr. and Mrs. Iden, who provided the endowment for this series. Oscar Iden was a Walsh School of Foreign Service graduate, 1924. He was practically one of the first. Past speakers in this series include George H.W. Bush, Dr. Anthony Lake, the Honorable Lee Hamilton, Ambassador John Negroponte, General Brent Scowcroft, George Tennant, the late Sandy Berger, and the president of the Wilson Center, the Honorable Jane Harmon, among many others. This year, it is the Institute's pleasure to partner with the Institute of Politics and Public Service at the McCourt School of Public Policy to present a moderated conversation with Mr. Ben Rhodes, the Assistant to the President and National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications and Speechwriting. His topic this afternoon is National Security, Communications, and Politics in a Complex World. Mr. Rhodes oversees all of President Obama's national security, communication, speechwriting, and global engagement. In a sense, he just completed his 8th State of the Union address and is also responsible for many of the president's more memorable domestic and global speeches. Previously, he served as Deputy Director of White House Speechwriting and a senior speechwriter for the Obama campaign. Prior to joining Obama for America, he worked for several years as special assistant to Lee Hamilton, a previous Iden Lecture presenter, where he helped draft the Iraq Study Group report and the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission. He is co-author with Lee Hamilton and Tom Kane of Without Precedent, the Inside Story of the 9/11 Commission. A native of New York City, and an avid Mets fan, I was told to mention. Ben has a BA from Rice University and an MFA from New York University. He's perhaps best known for channeling President Obama's voice for the public, but he also serves as one of the president's closest and longest-serving advisors. Given his role in the many national security decisions of this administration, we decided this year to present the lecture in an interactive format to allow for greater insight into how national security decision-making works at the White House. A moderated conversation is always far more interesting when the participants have an existing rapport. So 2 of Georgetown's own who have worked with Mr. Rhodes in different capacities will moderate today's discussion. Bernadette Meehan is a Dean and Virginia Rusk Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy on assignment to Georgetown from the Foreign Service. She most recently served as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and spokesperson for the National Security Council, where she worked for Mr. Rhodes for 3 years. Prior to the NSC, she served at the State Department as Special Assistant to Secretary Hillary Clinton, at the U.S. Consulate in Dubai, the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, and the U.S. Embassy in Bogota. In 2007, she was selected as a Colin Powell Fellow which recognizes one of 12 most promising future leaders in the Department of State. Prior to the Foreign Service, she was Vice President of Private Banking at J.P. Morgan and Assets Management at Lehman Brothers. She's a graduate of Boston College. Elleithee is the founding executive director of Georgetown's Institute of Politics and Public Service. Before launching the Institute, he spent nearly 2 years as one of the top communication strategists in the Democratic Party. Most recently, he was communication director of the Democratic National Committee. He is a veteran of 4 presidential campaigns. He is a political strategist for 4 current and former United States senators and 2 former governors, has advised on an independent expenditure campaign, the independent campaign, I can't quite do this one, independent expenditure campaign arms of both the DCCC and the DSCC, which he will translate later upon request, and has worked on numerous other state and local races. He's a founding partner in 2 of Washington's leading political consulting firms and is a frequent commentator on TV. Mo is a Hoya. He has an undergraduate degree from Georgetown School of Foreign Service and an MA in political management from the George Washington University. We have a great program today. I am very glad you are all able to join us, and with that, I am turning this over to Bernadette.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Ben, for being with us here today. As Barbara mentioned, I had the privilege of working for Ben for 3 years at the White House and really felt that you were one of the best bosses I've ever worked for. And in fact, when I was thinking about going to the White House and wasn't really sure whether it was going to be the right fit, Jake Sullivan, who at the time was the Deputy Chief of Staff at the State Department, said to me, if you have an opportunity to work for Ben Rhodes, it does not even matter what the position is, what you will be doing, you have to seize that opportunity. He is one of the best people you will ever have a chance to work for. And as usual, Jake Sullivan was correct, and it was a fantastic experience. So I'm excited to be able to share with some of my new Georgetown colleagues and students what that experience was like. So we thought we would start off with a mix of news of the day, see how it is to channel the president, what your experience has been like. So to start off, if you could walk us through what is your typical day like at the White House, when, to the extent that there is a typical day at the White House, when you come in, what happens between the time you sit down at your desk and you leave late at night?
Well, I mean, you must have forgotten in the several months since you left that there's no such thing as a typical day at the White House. But I guess the best I could do is, I will get in the morning and I receive the President's daily briefing. As you all know, the President receives a daily intelligence briefing. Those of us who participate in that session with him get our own version of that briefing as soon as we get into work. So you start the day with generally, there's usually not a lot of good news in that briefing, so it's a sobering start to the day. Then usually we reserve that 9 o'clock slot to coordinate across the government on what the most important messaging and congressional national security issues are. So for instance, this morning we had a session on Iran to review the status of all the different pieces of the many events that rolled out over the weekend. You recall those sessions.
I remember them fondly.
Then we tend to have the President's daily briefing, and that will be Susan Rice and Avril Haines, the Deputy National Security Advisor, Lisa Monaco, myself, the Vice President when he is in town. And so that's always fairly normal. But then the rest of the day, it tends to be driven by several different things. One is, in my role, I participate in the Deputies and Principals Committees, which essentially are the policy-making bodies of the government. So the various deputies from across the State Department, the Treasury Department, the intelligence community, they will meet, or if an issue is ripe for some decision, the cabinet-level officials will meet. I don't go to all of those sessions, because if you did, that's all you would do. But that's the kind of routine of policy making. That's one thing that could take up my time. The other elements are mainly if there is a major presidential engagement coming up, that is going to occupy my time. So if the president is going on a foreign trip, what is his schedule? What are we trying to get done? What policy are we trying to get across the goal line to announce? What speeches might he have to give? Thinking through essentially big presidential items, a trip, an announcement, a speech, that is something that will consume a fair amount of my time. If there is a very hot button pressing issue, there are no doubt going to be decisions that have to be made over the course of the day. So a situation like we had over the last several days, I will essentially cancel my schedule and do nothing but deal with Iran. So you're either planning for the next big thing that you know is coming, or you are responding to and drinking from the fire hose of world events. If that doesn't consume all of my time, there are a couple of other things. One is in the public diplomacy function I have is less prominent, but I think no less important. So kind of managing and overseeing the public diplomacy components of the government, our exchange programs, our global outreach, that takes up a segment of time. And then lastly, I have a series of issues that I've essentially taken some degree of ownership of, Cuba and Burma policy. So, occasionally checking in on things like that. But, you always start the day the same way, and then it always ends a way in which you
And
couldn't
what's
predict.
a typical ending of a day? If it's a good day, no surprises, what time are you at home?
Well, I always say this to people. It's not. I'm always amused to hear your biography to be reminded that you worked at J.P. Morgan. The hours are not as bad in terms of sitting in the office as the people I know who are lawyers and investment bankers. I'll get in at 8, but I'll be out of there by 8 most days. Not saying that's a short day. Hopefully you could even get out by 7. I have a young daughter. But the problem is, it doesn't stop when you go home. And the challenge in these jobs is not so much the total kind of hours logged at the office. It's that if something happens at 10 o'clock at night, you are expected to be able to deal with that at 10 o'clock at night. If something happens at 2 in the morning, you are expected to deal with it at 2 in the morning. I've long planned to go to New York last weekend for the long weekend. That obviously did not happen. So the more difficult challenge I find in terms of time management and kind of husbanding your own energy is that you're never off. It's like being a doctor or something. The phone could ring in the middle of the night, and that's all. Nobody's going to care that you had to pick your kid up from daycare, or so that's where I think the time pressure comes.
And how do you consume information? You talk about in the morning you come in, you get the president's daily brief, you have these initial meetings in the morning, but presumably you're aware of what's going on in the world. Are you a physical newspaper reader? You have an iPad, you're searching Twitter to see what, sort of the Beltway is saying, and how do you maintain that throughout the day?
So it's a good question. I consume information in a very distorting and unhealthy way. And I have for 10 years, and Mo can attest to this. The first day I went to work on the Obama campaign, I actually was not, for all the kind of, I'm political, I was a think tank person. I was from the Wilson Center, so I expected to come and write these foreign policy speeches and be kind of a thoughtful, inspiring experience. And the first day I got my email account, I had 500 emails in my inbox. And 470 of them were what we would call press clips, that there are media monitors who just are constantly sending the latest iteration of the New York Times story, the Washington Post story, the whatever it is. And so you consume information. I used to be a physical newspaper reader, magazine reader, et cetera. But when you're in these jobs, information is fed to you from media monitors who are just sending volumes of information to you. That has evolved in the course of my time in government. It used to be you'd wake up and, there's a routine to this. Here are the New York Times stories, here are the Washington Post stories, here are the Wall Street Journal stories, here are the Wire stories. Now it's like, here's tweets. And it's a very distorting thing because, a newspaper actually is a helpful filter because you can see what's on the front page of the New York Times. But when you get the front page article from the New York Times emailed to you, and then the next thing that might be emailed to you is, at Rocketman72 says, they're a bunch of idiots on Iran. You have to be you have to assign relative value to what you're consuming, and Twitter has accelerated what was already a news cycle wherein, I felt that there was a trap where people were too focused on, there was a cable news flare-up. And people are responding to that because they're concerned about it, because it's kind of driving the conversation in Washington for a few hours. If that was already a problem, Twitter has just accelerated that, where it's like, oh my God, what are we going to do about this? And on foreign policy in particular, you just can't get, the Iran deal would have died 1,000 deaths if we let every, negative story or statement shape how we thought about it. So you have to have an ability to consume enough information to know kind of what's going on out there, both in terms of real world events and in terms of Washington conversation. But you also have to know how to shut out enough of that so that you're not going to overreact and get knocked off course. And one of the things that I like about working for this president is he doesn't get knocked off course. It took 7 years to get the Iran deal done. And if he had allowed himself to be buffeted by politics or even certain international events or international criticism, you would not have the Iranian nuclear program rolled back.
So speaking about Iran, this is one of the news of the day topics we felt we sort of had to address. We anticipate the audience in the Q&A will have lots of questions about news of the day and things that are going on. But having worked on the Iran deal, obviously closely with you for several years, I, with the rest of the world, watched and personally thought it was fantastic. So congratulations. My question is, we saw two announcements in tandem. Obviously, the fact that there was the implementation day of what you said has been sort of a very long process to get to this point, in tandem with the news that there was the release of these 4 Americans plus a 5th American who left under different circumstances. You have said in the past that a world in which there is a deal with Iran means it's more likely to produce an evolution in Iranian behavior than a world in which there is no deal. But we have also heard the president consistently say that this does not herald a rapprochement or a broader warming of relations with Iran. So the question for you is, now that we have sort of the implementation of the heralded Iran deal, what is implementation day plus 1 week, plus 2 weeks, plus a month, plus a year? What behavior changes would you anticipate out of Tehran, if any? Is it sort of the opposite of what an optimist would think? Do you expect that they will start to push the boundaries because the hardliners need to probe the system? And does this, as a tangent, mean that there is hope for more cooperation in resolving the issues in Syria? And if so, how does that happen? What does the space look like?
So I'd just say a few things. I mean, first of all, the nuclear side of this is almost hard to overstate. I mean, in the last 4 months, you had a nuclear program that had been accelerating over many years. In the last 4 months, they disconnected 2/3 of their centrifuges. They put 98% of their stockpile on a ship and just got rid of it. They yanked the calandria out of that reactor and filled it with concrete. By the way, before they even had the plan for the new reactor, they just wanted to get it done because that's how badly they wanted to get implementation day. So kind of a sea change in what their nuclear program looks like, and the issue that overhung this entire region, overhung the entire non-proliferation regime, really is resolved for the foreseeable future, provided continued monitoring. It does show, though, the important point is they really have clearly compartmented the nuclear issue and allowed Rouhani, Zarif, Dr. Elleithee, the head of their nuclear program, to manage that account. Because we had no problem, when there were issues with implementation, they were technical, we could raise them, say, hey, we have this concern, the concern was addressed. So there is this kind of, it's hard to overstate, the importance of, they really have decided to deal with the nuclear issue for the time being, at least, in a constructive manner. And the inspections regime is going to have to monitor whether there's any slippage in that. That's the first point I make. The second point I make is the nuclear negotiations established diplomacy and diplomatic channels between the two countries that just did not exist 3 years ago. And that doesn't mean that there's a change in behavior yet, which I'll get to. It does mean, though, that we can communicate with this government. 4 years ago, when something would happen, like the sailor incident, or anything for that matter, it was, we would have our UN ambassador find their UN ambassador, pass a message that their UN ambassador would then have to send back to Tehran, process it there in their system, which is opaque to us. They then will tell the Swiss at our interest section what the answer is to that message. I mean, this is not picking up the phone and talking to somebody, right?
Clunky and time-consuming.
Yeah, and inefficient, and you don't know who you're actually talking to, and you can't learn about how their decisions are made in Iran. And what has already been beneficial from the nuclear deal is that we have an ability to communicate and deliver messages. So on the American citizens, we were able to essentially roll the nuclear negotiations into a channel to resolve that issue, and that was and it was a negotiation because everything with the Iranians is a negotiation, but we were able to grind that issue down and get it done on terms that we were very happy with. The sailors is actually, in many respects, a better example because, I don't know where that incident would have led 4 years ago. You have, U.S. Navy personnel in Iranian waters near an IRGC, contingent, and you could easily see how in 2009 or 2011 it could have escalated. Yeah. They're holding them. It becomes a crisis because it's a kind of a public issue in both countries. We have to respond before they're out in ways that escalate. Whereas here, John Kerry called Javad Zarif, and they were released in a few hours. Which is kind of a much healthier, more functional way of resolving issues and avoiding escalation. So the second point I make is that we have the ability to resolve issues. And by the way, there are going to be other issues. There are going to be irritants. There are just going to be things that come up that will benefit from diplomatic communication between the United States and Iran. The third point is the next major test is Syria. I don't know. I mean, there have already been, the Syria talks already look different today than they did 2 years ago because Iran is at the table in them, and they weren't 2 years ago. So you already have a situation where you actually have the right countries in the Vienna process, in that you have Iran and Russia along with the United States, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, and others from the region. So you have the right mix of players, you have the right template and timeline for resolving the issue, and you have the major sticking point of Assad. And we'll have to see whether Iran's position on that evolves in a more constructive fashion, or frankly, you'll have to see if Iran's decision-making evolves, because our sense has not been that the foreign ministry is the lead actor in Iran's Syria policy. So that bears watching. So that's a test, not the only test, because like I said, there'll be other issues. The last thing is internal, how will Iran evolve? And that we don't know. But we'll learn a lot with their modules elections that are coming up next month. So they have a very important set of elections. They'll be choosing a new modules. Clearly, that will be a test as to whether or not, one, can the more reform-oriented people even field a slate of candidates? Two, does the election go off in a way that is reasonably fair? And three, who wins? And so I think you will see what that says. I mean, no question there will continue to be pushback from hardliners in the Iranian system who don't want there to be rapprochement with the West in general, forget even the United States. But you also see within Iran, like just an enormous, well of support for moving in a different direction, and how those two things sort themselves out. Our judgment in the nuclear deal is that ultimately there was such public support for making the deal that even though the hardliners opposed it, they could not ignore that public support.
And do you think that there is enough substance there that this change becomes institutionalized, or is this a John Kerry, Javad Zarif, and depending on what happens with our election, depending on what happens with the Majlis elections in Iran, that this has the potential to sort of backslide? Are we still sort of on such tenuous footing that there's no way to tell whether this is enshrined?
I think
in a way that we make
I think that we
progress?
don't know yet, and I think the reason why is it goes in both directions. On the Iranian side, look, we didn't make this progress when Ahmadinejad was the president. So look at how much the Iranian approach to negotiation changed under Rouhani and Zarif. That shows you that it could go back the other direction, right? We don't know who the next president of the United States is going to be either. What we do know, though, is that we've demonstrated to skeptical audiences in both countries that there can be mutually successful outcomes. Look, the nuclear deal was a very good deal for us because it resolves our biggest proliferation concern. It rolls back their nuclear program and avoids a war. It's a good deal for them in the sense that they are going to get relief from sanctions that were crippling their economy. And so it does demonstrate that, through very difficult diplomacy, we can find outcomes that are acceptable on both sides. I think so there's a question as to whether or not both systems can sustain that momentum and find other issues to direct that type of effort towards. The second, and just briefly, is how does Iran respond to the increased engagement with the rest of the world? Does the sanctions relief and the greater interconnectivity that's going to bring to the Iranian people, does that serve as a kind of a moderating impulse in Iranian society in the sense that students and middle-class Iranians who are more inclined to be less radical and less hostile to the United States and Israel and other countries, are they empowered in a way that has an evolutionary effect on Iranian society? That will play out over a longer period.
That's a wait and see over a longer period of time.
Yeah.
Okay. Another sort of recent event that makes for a non-typical day at the White House, obviously, is the State of the Union. So you're used to this after 8 years. As Barbara mentioned, I think Dan Pfeiffer was tweeting out, you are one of the few people in history who has had a role probably in 8 State of the Unions. As the writer of the Cairo speech, having a role in the president's Nobel Prize winning speech, some of the most famous and memorable speeches of his presidency. Can you walk us through what it is like to write a speech and channel the voice of the President of the United States? Do you walk in and sit down and have a beer and discuss an outline? Does he give you all of his notes on a legal pad? I mean, he is quite an eloquent writer himself. What is that process like? Do you like students here get a paper back with lots of cross outs and red marks on it?
Is that how you teach?
That's not how I teach. How does that process work? Walk us through that.
First of all, did anybody see the movie Bull Durham in here? Yep. So at least one person. I'm getting older. Yeah. Like there's a thing in that where Crash Davis, the Kevin Costner character, sets the record at the end for the most home runs by a minor league player in history, and he doesn't really want that out there. I kind of feel like that. 8 State of the Unions kind of suggests why have you been in the same job for 8 years?
Well, that's another question.
But anyway, no, it's one of the reasons why I've been in the same job for 8 years is it's actually a very interesting process to work with the president on speeches. He cares about them. He cares about what he's saying, and he always wants to make an argument. The very shorthand way in which a speech goes is I will sit down with him at the beginning, and he will essentially just kind of talk for up to an hour about what does he want to achieve. And sometimes he'll be very specific, and he'll even kind of, here's the outline of the argument I want to make. Sometimes he'll just kind of throw ideas out, even rhetoric out that he wants to put in there. And you get this kind of burst of input from him that you then take and go alone in your quiet space and write.
Where's the quiet space? Are you at Starbucks with your iPod?
You kind of are. I mean, it's
at a library.
There's actually a library that is buried in the 5th floor of the executive office building that nobody ever goes to. That I think is one of the nicest, most quiet places where nobody can find you. I've now ruined my
until today.
Yeah, until today. Or Starbucks. But you try to get some distance from. What's hard for me is I used to just be a speechwriter, and there you could just spend 4 days in isolation and see nobody and work on it. Now I am running back and forth to my other job. But you write something, and then you enter this process where you send it around to everybody who needs to see it, the policy advisors, White House staff. Then you're in this kind of interesting, moment where you're kind of a goalkeeper, and what edits can get past the goalie. And the main thing there is you have to make some changes, but you don't want to make so many that it starts sounding less like the president, more like kind of a summation of legal, the output of a white paper, instead of speech. And then it goes back to the president, and he will sometimes just completely rewrite it himself and come back and say, it's a bad try when you walk in, he says, I think we need to make some structural changes. That's always like the code word for like, you really did not do a very good job with this draft. And so that could be, that means you have to kind of go back and redo the outline and rewrite the speech. Or he'll just start line editing it, and he will just line edit it over and over again until he gets it in the way he wants. Now, he doesn't do this for the Tuesday statement on X announcement, but for a big speech, he will spend, he will go through 10 to 15 rounds of line editing until it's exactly how he wants it. The most high-wire version of this was the Nobel address, which was right after the Afghan announcement. So we did this big primetime speech at West Point. Then we turned around and write this Nobel Prize speech, thought it was great. The morning that we were going to leave to Oslo, he calls me in with John Favreau, the other speechwriter, and just gives us a totally different speech that he'd written by hand overnight. And when we left to get on the plane to Oslo, we hadn't even gotten him the draft of the speech, and we stayed up the whole night on the plane doing this crazy exercise. We finally made him go to sleep for an hour because he had to deliver the speech. And so that's like the most extreme version of, that's extreme speech writing. But the only thing I'd say just to the State of the Union is, what's interesting is, on the one hand, it's hard to say things new after 8 years. So, but on the other hand, you have 8 years to draw from. So when we came in, what was nice is everything he was kind of saying for the first time. And everyone was listening because it was this huge seismic change in America and hugely consequential world events. And so that was one kind of speech writing. Now, on the one hand, it's hard because people have heard Barack Obama for 10 years, and you don't want to sound like a greatest hits album, right? As good as those are, it's not as good as the first album. But you have a record. So what I liked about this State of the Union is it's not a hypothetical argument we're making about foreign policy. We're like, here's our approach. Here's the Iran deal. Here's how we dealt with Ebola. Here's how we dealt with Cuba. Here's why we think that this is the right way to deal with ISIL. So it's a very different kind of speech writing than 8 years ago, wherein 8 years ago you're trying to say, here's what I want to do, and now you can say, here's what I did, and here's why I think that's a better approach. And so this State of the Union was essentially kind of the summary on foreign policy. Hey, there's a lot of people who are saying a lot of different things about what we should do in the world. Here's what I've done, and here's why I think this is the right way to do things.
What's your favorite speech you've written for him or worked on in some way?
I never know the answer to that question. I guess the Nobel speech was the most interesting to me because it was a weirdly personal. Foreign policy is often hard to kind of personalize, but that was a very personal window into here's how Barack Obama looks at the world, how he approaches these issues, how he makes decisions. So I think that was interesting because you don't usually get to do that on foreign policy. And part of that's because he dug into it and he did so much of it himself that he was kind of leading us as speechwriters to letting us into his brain and directing us to, we were writing about policy. He came back with Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi and Reinhold Niebuhr, and because he was trying to work through some stuff there. I mean, you try winning the Nobel Peace Prize when you're about to send 30,000 people to war, and he took it seriously, and what came out was interesting. Then there are lots of other ones that were fun or interesting all the way back to the campaign, but I'd point to that one.
So as someone, going back to the campaign, as someone who worked on the other side of that primary in 2008, I've long been an admirer of your work, even if it was begrudgingly so, for 2 years there. Besides the speeches that we talked about and that you're so well known for, you've become a national security and foreign policy advisor to the president on everything from Egypt and Libya and Syria to the reopening of relations with Myanmar and Cuba. So I want to take a step back and wonder how the hell you got there. Because you don't come from the typical trajectory neither diplomat nor professional politico. So let's walk through your path just a little bit. You grew up in Manhattan. What's your first political memory?
That's an interesting question. What was interesting is my first political memory was of personalities, and the two were Ed Koch. I remember there's still a picture of me when I was like 6 years old, wearing a plastic batting helmet with a wiffle ball bat, like standing with Ed Koch in Central Park, because he used to just walk around and I thought it was so cool. Like the mayor just walks around by himself, and he's this big, larger-than-life personality. And so New York politics, which you know something about, is kind of like it's not like anywhere else. It's this kind of personality-driven thing. And I remember being intrigued by that. But in terms of national politics, the surprising thing is my dad was like a Reagan devotee. Like he loved Ronald Reagan. And I actually remember him like being totally fired up about this 1984 election. And that was the first time I was kind of old enough to process. There was a presidential election going on. And he was, but the point is that Ed Koch and Ronald Reagan were both like just big figures. I didn't even know anything about what they thought about things. They were just they occupied, as someone who kind of grew up in the 80s, they occupied a lot of my psychic space, because they were just such like larger-than-life personalities. And so my introduction was via personality rather than like, party affiliation.
You wanted to be a writer, right? A fiction writer. I mean, I guess you are a writer, but you were going to go a different path. Right?
Don't be like the right-wing trolls here.
So you still do fiction, just right? So you were going to go in a different path, but you landed a gig one summer when you came home from college, working for Rudy Giuliani, right?
Well, that was different. So that was before I wanted to be a fiction writer. And the thing there was, I loved New York politics. I kind of, I thought it was interesting. And that I was kind of a freshman in college, and I needed a summer job, and that was his re-election campaign. And back then it seems almost impossible now, right? How did this guy work for Rudy Giuliani and I'm working for Barack Obama? But Giuliani back then, he was conservative in the New York sense, but I mean the New York sense is pretty liberal. So it didn't. I wasn't particularly ideological either way at the time. It was a fascinating job because I got to go all over New York and every neighborhood. And
what did you do for the campaign?
I worked in the press office, so I started doing press clips, and now I sound old. Like literally, I had to like cut out, like you remember that, right? And like glue sticks, and New York Newsday and the Post and the Daily News. I mean, very different. That's where I started. And then I did a little bit of everything, whatever I ended up working directly for the spokesperson, Sonny Mandel, who's like a real New York character. And I do everything from like go to a Ruth Messenger event to see, what she's saying, to, going down to, videotape some union endorsement of Giuliani in Staten Island or something, So I was basically the young kid that the communications director liked, who did all that stuff. And that was a remarkable education. Now, what ironically ended up happening is I finished my college degree. I go into get an MFA at NYU in fiction writing. But I stayed interested in New York politics, and I was working on a city council campaign for another larger-than-life machine boss, Vito Lopez, who ended up having a very precipitous downfall for those who follow New York politics. But he was running a city council candidate in Brooklyn who I was working for, a Democrat. It just shows New York politics, you work for, the local person. And on 9/11, I was working a polling site because it was election
That was
day.
primary day.
Yeah, that was primary day. So I was like watching a polling site in North Williamsburg for this city council candidate, Diana Reyna. And 9/11, I had a kind of unmolested view of the whole thing. I saw the second plane hit. I saw the first tower go down. And, my fiction masters felt very irrelevant to the scale of the moment that I was in as a New Yorker, and that was the first kind of. I've had if I had always had an interest in politics and an interest in writing, suddenly I was less interested in the fiction writing as soon as that happened, and that was kind of everything after that was about getting involved in whatever was going to happen after 9/11. And I didn't know what form that would take. I always say to students, I never set out to be like in the White House as a speechwriter. I only ended up in the White House as a speechwriter because I didn't set out to do that. If you had done all the things you think you should do to get in that job, I never would have gotten that job. I just did things that led me there through a different kind of route.
So how did you go from being an aspiring fiction writer, watching the calamity of 9/11 in real time in New York, to Washington and putting that new motivation into practice?
So I finished that degree in the spring. And that's kind of a degree where you go to school at night and you have a bunch of jobs in the day. So it wasn't going to be, but I did need to figure out, okay, what am I going to do now? It's not like law school where you go to a law firm. You don't go to the fiction writing, department. So I was looking at jobs in New York, which, encompassed like kind of publishing, because that's what someone would do with that type of degree in New York. But I said, what I really wanted to do is get into journalism and international affairs. That was kind of where my head was. I know how to write. I have a decent educational background in this space, and I'll do whatever I need to do to get in the door. So I came down to Washington. I interviewed with a whole bunch of different people, and one guy at Foreign Policy magazine said to me, "Look, you're telling me you want to write," and I was very honest. I was like, "I want to write. That's my skill." But I want to be connected to international affairs. I want to be connected to these events. He said, "Don't come work for this magazine. You'll end up, maybe you'll fact check a few sidebars, and 6 months from now you'll get to write like a nice little piece about something." He's like, "If you want to write, like you ever think about being a speechwriter?" And that's actually not something that anybody ever thinks about becoming. And he said, "Because I know this guy Lee Hamilton, who he just told me yesterday that he's looking for a speechwriter, and to let him know if I see anybody." And so he connected me with Hamilton, who was running the Wilson Center, and I clicked with Lee Hamilton. I got this job. Here's this guy who's a former congressman from Indiana, now running a think tank. Couldn't be more different from me as a New Yorker, but kind of dispositionally had a very similar kind of pragmatic view of the world that I ended up, developing. And so I always tell people, like, that was a chance to take. I was in New York. I could see where that would lead. But I moved down to Washington, went to work for this guy, Lee Hamilton, set up in a new city where I didn't know anybody. And 6 months after I went to work for him, he got appointed vice chair of the 9/11 Commission. So suddenly this job, it was, a good job, but was kind of in the quiet think tank corner of the world, was caught up in these big events. And so some of it was, I was lucky to work for a Democrat who was appointed to the 9/11 Commission and the Iraq Study Group. So I got this kind of hands-on experience on the two biggest issues of that time, terrorism and the Iraq War, working for Hamilton.
How'd you meet Barack Obama?
So I, in 2004, like everybody, well, not everybody else, like some of us, was very, I was a kind of an early believer. I was kind of following even the Senate campaign, this guy looked different. I mean, not just looked different, but like was different from kind of what I saw in Washington. And so I always kind of had I was one of those people who was hoping he had these bigger ambitions. The one thing that was frustrating about working for the 9/11 Commission, the Iraq Study Group, on the one hand, it was great to see these statesmen come together and find common ground and chart a new way. But you also get a sense that, like, well, the 9/11 Commission can have recommendations. It can make government better at intelligence sharing and homeland security, very important things. But that's not going to change the fundamental direction of our foreign policy. The Iraq Study Group, same thing. We laid out a blueprint of things that we thought should happen in Iraq. But you realize that there's only so far you can get if you're not political. The politicians make the decisions that direct the course of our foreign policy. And so I felt very strongly that I wanted to work on a political campaign in 2008 because all the things I'd learned about the U.S. government and our foreign policy, the only thing that was really going to redirect that was who was going to win that election. So I kind of started offering myself up to be a speechwriter, and I actually wrote speeches for Mark Warner in 2006, like a handful of speeches. I think you, Mo, you were connected with them, yeah. And but he decided not to run for president in like the fall of 2006, which is right when Barack Obama dipped his toe in the water. So I immediately just basically, and this is the other piece of advice, is work for free. I just said, I knew enough people around Barack Obama that I was just like, look, whatever you want me to do, I'll do it. And I wrote, I remember writing in January of 2007 an op-ed for the Irish Times, about our Irish policy. I was ready to do anything, but like they needed it. They needed it. What ended up, answer to your question is they needed a speechwriter. They needed a speechwriter who could do foreign policy because they didn't have that. Foreign policy was going to matter a lot in the election because our difference with Hillary Clinton at the time was the Iraq War vote, and things of that nature. And the principal foreign policy staffer that he had ended up getting deployed to Iraq. So I ended up having to fill a bunch of that space, Mark Lippert. So on campaigns, interesting things happen. You become kind of the utility player. So you're doing the speech writing, but you're also, someone needs to prep the senator for an interview on foreign policy. Somebody needs to help draft the debate prep materials. And so suddenly you're kind of in different spaces. And that that was the role that kind of emerged for me over the course of that campaign.
I'll ask one more question about that campaign and toss it back over to more current events. But one of the things I remember most vividly about the 2008 campaign was it was all about Iraq. It was all about Iraq. It was all about Iraq. And that was the symbol of the change that he was calling for until about 6 weeks before Election Day when the economy, the bottom dropped. And suddenly it was all about the economy, and it was all about the economy, and it was all about the economy. You're the foreign policy guy. You're the national security guy. What do you do, right? When suddenly the orientation of the campaign has shifted, not the core message, but the orientation has shifted, and you're now playing in different waters. What do you do?
So I'd say a couple of things. First of all, what's interesting about the Iraq, all about Iraq thing, this connects it to Iran, is the week I went to work for Barack Obama, full time, was the week of that YouTube debate when he said, in response to a question, that he would engage the leaders of Iran. This guy listed kind of all the bad guys in the world, Iran, Cuba, North Korea, and said, would you engage them without preconditions? And he said, yes. And he was attacked. Like, that was a big mistake. We can't talk to these people.
I think I was one of the guys that attacked
Yeah,
you
probably,
yeah.
And he did something very interesting. And I remember it's one of the first times I met him in person. He was like, I think that's wrong. I think that's the kind of thinking that like got us into Iraq, right? And so we constructed this whole argument that took Iraq and made it bigger, and was like, you know what? The same mentality that says that you have to go along with this war in Iraq says that you can't even talk to Iran, and that's going to lead us into another war with Iran. And that like struck a chord. So we were able to take Iraq and build this bigger argument about doing things differently. And what's been very gratifying about sticking around for so long is to see the opening of Cuba and the nuclear deal with Iran, because it's kind of rooted in that. It shows that arguments you develop in a political campaign, there's a thread that runs all the way through to implementation day. But that aside, on the economy, there are a couple things. One thing that's interesting is that when you're a speechwriter in a campaign, you know this, if you write the first speech on a topic, like you're the guy on that topic,
expert,
right?
yeah.
So I used to write speeches about domestic policy too. And I wrote a speech in March about rolling out our kind of Wall Street regulation, approach. So I became kind of the regulation guy. And what I remember is like when Lehman Brothers collapsed, Bernadette used to work there. When Lehman Brothers collapsed, he was going to have to give a speech the next day at Colorado, some rally. And they're like, Rhodes, you got to rewrite the speech overnight. And I'm like, why am I rewriting the speech? And by that time I was kind of just doing foreign policy because it's general election. And they're like, because you wrote the speech in March on this stuff, and basically just take that and get with the econ guys and figure it out. And I remember talking to Brian Deese, and he's like, and this was the moment in which I shifted from being on a political campaign to governing, because we were clearly likely to win. I remember him saying to me, Ben, there's a 50% chance that the global economy collapses tonight. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, what does that even, what am I supposed to do with that? And he's like, well, there's this yen trading, and if things go a certain way in Japan, like the entire global economy could just collapse tonight. But it's only like a 50% chance, And so we were in a different space. Yeah. So the first thing I remember about that is like, this wasn't like a hope and change exercise anymore. This was like, very consequential events are already happening. There's a vacuum of political leadership in the country. And like he was already having to act more so than normal for someone who hasn't won yet. He was going to have to start kind of acting like someone who was governing. The transition was like as if he was already president. I mean, it was very strange. We had no space. So that's what I remember at the specific point of it feeling like this isn't just like, some notion. We're already, what we say matters to like markets. Like global markets are going to pay attention even though he's still a candidate. Then the last thing I just say about this is what was difficult for my job when we got in, and people forget this, is nobody wanted to hear about foreign policy for like the first 2 years of the administration. Like we'd do the State of the Union, and I'd submit my foreign policy section, and they'd tell me to cut it in half because nobody in the country, they wanted economy. And actually, I remember one of the sources of tension that developed in the kind of interagency was people felt like the White House wasn't letting people, when it were centralizing the discussion of issues on foreign policy. No, the White House was saying nobody's allowed to talk about foreign policy because all people want to hear about is the economy. So it was actually hard out of the box to explain what we were doing on some very important foreign policy issues because the demand was entirely the political demand, and frankly the public demand was, what are you doing to 700,000 jobs are being lost a month? Okay, I'm interested in your non-proliferation policy, but what are you going to do to stop this?
I think we'll go ahead and open it up to questions, and then we'll come back for just a couple closing questions before we wrap up. So if folks have questions, if you just want to sort of step up to the microphone here, and I know there must be questions in a group like this, so feel free to just step up and yes, please make it a question. Welcome very short comments, but it should be a question, and just let us know where you're from.
Hi, my name is Rebecca. I actually am a federal government employee. And my question is, do you think you'll ever run for office?
Oh, God. No. No. I mean, well, it's an interesting question. I've never thought about it. But no.
This is how it starts.
Yeah. I will say this. I'm more likely to kind of go in the direction of, having my own views and kind of wanting to be heard on issues, but not necessarily wanting to run for office. I do think that I know a bunch of people kind of my age, a lot of whom worked kind of on the Obama campaign, who are wrestling with this question. It is not an appetizing thing to think about doing. I cannot imagine like fundraising, half my time or so. I do worry that like I see a lot of people from the Obama campaign and the Obama administration who are like probably 20 years ago would be running for Congress by now, who are like working in Silicon Valley or doing something else because the demands of running for office and being in office are so different than when like Lee Hamilton was there and you just tried to be the best congressman you could and you went home to explain things to your constituents and maybe you raised money for like a month before your campaign, which lasted 2 months, So I don't feel a personal like itch to do it in the first place, and I'm more likely to kind of do other things. But the broader point, I guess, is that I hope that as people are wrestling with issues of campaign finance reform and other things, that there is this kind of thought about what type of people are we disincentivizing from running for office. I'm not talking about myself. I'm talking about just kind of people of my generation, and what kind of people are we incentivizing to run for office? And because we should. I worry that there are people who, when Mo got into this line of work, people who would have run for Congress then who are looking at the fundraising demands and the permanent campaign demands and the political climate in Washington and are turned off of it. Thanks.
Hi, Ben. My name's Laura Jakes. I'm an editor at Foreign Policy Magazine.
I know you, Laura.
I sort of wonder what life would look like for both of us if we'd taken that fact-checking job.
It was at Foreign Policy Magazine.
I know.
Yeah.
That's why I wonder. As we talk about the extent that you channel Obama, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about to the extent that the president channels you. That is, what specific examples, if any, that you feel like you've had a lot of impact on shaping policy in this administration? And also, just very quickly, do you think you will work for another administration or another presidency in the future? Thank you.
It was on the second question. I don't plan to. I'm not. I think I'll be getting some more distance. After 8 years in this kind of intense environment, in this kind of intense collaboration with this president, I would never say never, of course, and I won't comment on who I think the next president will be, but it's not something that I'm like. It's not something I'm seeking to do. On the first question, I think that in terms of viewpoints on issues, for so long my job has been to essentially try to figure out what is the president going to think about this, how is he going to talk about it, how is he going to want to approach it, are we kind of doing what he wants us to do. Our worldviews are very similar, and I'm very comfortable in that space. I rarely find myself, in some profound difference from him. Where there are issues that fall in the category that you ask about, I think sometimes it's getting his attention on an issue. And the most obvious one for me is Myanmar. I became very interested in this policy because I saw it as a potential opening to do something affirmative. And part of the reason is so much of what you end up doing in the White House can be just managing crises or responding to difficult circumstances. So when Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell came to see me in 2011 and described where they were in the policy review on Burma and described what they were hearing from Aung San Suu Kyi and other people in Burma and said that, boy, if the president could get involved in this, we think we could really kind of blow through an opening and have an opportunity to help, fundamentally support change in this country. It was appealing in part because it was affirmative, and like not everything you do every day in these jobs is affirmative. And so ever since then, part of my role has been, would the president normally come to work and have Burma on the brain? Not necessarily, But, when I saw we were going to Cambodia, well, there's a perfect opportunity to go to Burma. We're gonna be right there, and let's get you, let's, then he could see for himself what was happening. His visit itself could generate some momentum. And so over the years, I think that's an example of, here's an issue that a little bit of presidential tension can make a difference. And part of what I can do is make sure he doesn't lose the thread on this, that he's checking in regularly. Before the election in Burma last fall, I went out with the letters from him to Thein Sein and Aung San Suu Kyi, and so that's an example not so much of having a different view or changing his mind, so much as he very much supports what we're doing and has, but it's keeping a focus and attention on something that might otherwise not get that focus and attention. And Cuba was a bit, someone had to do the talks with Cuba, but a lot of people had a lot of other things going on. So again, for me, it's less of like changing his mind about something and more of, actually, I know that Cuba is something he very much wanted to do, and so I wanted to help him do that. But it's more, how can you make sure that something is getting a sufficient amount of presidential attention and engagement? Because absent doing that, it's not clear that there would be a normal, focus on something like a Burma.
Hi, my name is Theo Montgomery. I'm a sophomore here in the School of Foreign Service, and I'm very interested in climate change, and I think a lot about the intersection between national security and international affairs and climate change. Obviously, it's a very global issue, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about Barack Obama's legacy with climate change. How important do you think it is in terms of thinking about his legacy, and how much do you think is going to carry over into the next 4 or 8 years, depending on who's president? Do you think climate policy is going to stay similar or change depending on which party comes in? If you have any thoughts on that, yeah. Thank you.
So it's hugely important, and I won't even make the case for why it is, because I think that is evident. The things I'd say in terms of the legacy, when we came into office and went to Copenhagen in 2009, and that climate conference just collapsed. There was no framework for how to approach international climate change, in the sense that you had a Kyoto framework in which the rich countries have to do a lot, the developing countries, including China and India, don't have to do much at all, and by the way, the rich countries have to write a big check for everybody else to mitigate the consequences of climate change. And that was just not going to work. It was designed for a different time. So we had to do a number of things. One, we had to kind of build a new framework to address climate change. And that's the one that ended up being Paris, wherein we still do more as developed countries, but everybody has to do something. There is a mix of financing for adaptation and mitigation when it comes to climate change. But that importantly, not only are people committing to do things, there is transparency and reporting associated with those commitments, so there's an ability to monitor that people are living up to their obligations and their responsibilities over time. But there are two other really important things that happen. One is, and this is, the president really did, we made climate change a bilateral issue with all these countries. So it's not just, Todd Stern's a wonderful negotiator, but part of what unlocked some of this is, with China, climate change became one of our leading bilateral issues. With Brazil, with India, when we showed up to talk to them, they knew that was going to be in the top 2 or 3 issues that we were going to be dealing with. If that wasn't the case, you never would have had the joint announcement with China a year ago, in which they set out targets to reduce their emissions, that basically created the space for Paris to happen. So one thing that has to continue to happen is we have to make climate change a bilateral foreign policy issue in all of our major relationships, especially with the emerging countries, with China, India, South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia. When we meet with ASEAN countries, this is what we talk about. And so that kind of changed the conversation, because suddenly they're going to talk to the United States, not just about terrorism, but also about climate change. The last thing is the mobilization of the market forces in the private sector. And this is the thing that kind of unlocked the ambition associated with Paris, because the innovation of Paris is not only do you have everybody signing up to these commitments, but every 5 years we're going to renew those commitments. And if you look at what the United States did on clean energy, with the extra push in funding we made and in fuel efficiency standards we made at the beginning of the administration, we created all this activity that we have nothing to do with in the private sector that allowed us to hit our targets much faster than we thought. And so if you apply that theory globally, if the signal coming out of Paris is that there are market forces that are going to be driving the direction of clean energy, and there's going to be investments in technology, like along the lines of what Bill Gates announced, a venture capital fund in this space. 5 years from now, those targets can get much more ambitious. So instead of just being a kind of 2.5 degrees target, we get down to 2 degrees. So that's all kind of been set in motion. So some of this is inevitable. And people say, well, new president comes in office and they might. First of all, I think tearing up a deal that the entire world has signed up to would be a strange way to start your time in office. I mean, this isn't even just the nuclear deal. This is 197 countries. I mean, I guess you could do it, but it would be a strange way to start your time in office. The second thing is, I think this movement in the private sector is happening anyway. India is getting into solar energy, and that's going to happen. But this prioritization in our relations with other countries, that does entirely depend on who the president is. And if we take our foot off the gas, like, it's not like all these countries wanted to do. These are hard things for some of these countries to do. India, Brazil. If we take our foot off the gas, instead of 5 years from now upping the ambition from Paris, I think you might see kind of a lagging in the ambition. The United States has to, because the whole goal of Paris is each 5 years we're getting more and more ambitious, and that's the only way to mitigate the worst effects. And so whoever the next president is going to have a huge amount to say about whether Paris is just kind of another well-meaning effort that kind of barely crosses the lowest threshold, or whether it is this kind of constantly elevating degree of ambition.
Thank you for the Q&A today. It's been very insightful. My name is Mike Fox. I'm a second-year Master of Science in Foreign Service student and a fellow at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. I'm curious if you could share an anecdote about when what you felt was internationally right was at conflict with what might have been domestically, politically popular, and what your thought process was during the decision-making involved, especially drawing on your own background in campaign work. Thank you.
It's an interesting question.
It's one of my students.
One example that is maybe not as black and white is Iran, in the sense that there is a momentum to politics in which in January of 2000, January 2014, there would have been another sanctions bill. And so we reached the interim deal in November. But every 2 years there's a sanctions bill in Congress, and passes 99 to nothing because one person just happens to be out of town. And there was another bill like that was kind of working its way through committees and everything. And we reached the interim deal, but we met with a bunch of members of Congress, a bunch of outside interest groups, and they all said, okay, well, the deal is good, but we're going to have to pass these sanctions. And we said, well, no, you can't. We just reached this interim deal. We're going to see if we can get a permanent deal. And they're like, well, we'll pass the sanctions with a trigger, for after, some time period. And they kept thinking that we would say yes to something. And the president said, no, and I'll veto. Whatever you do, I'll veto it. And there was a kind of a week where that was more than a week, but there was this period of time when nobody knew quite what to do with that, and we didn't know exactly how that was going to play out, because that was not the politically popular thing, certainly on the Hill, and you had the Israeli Prime Minister opposing the deal very publicly. You had our Gulf partners who were pretty influential around Washington opposing it, and what was interesting though is that it was the argument in miniature that we had in a much bigger way after the deal itself, when the president kind of drew a line and said, I think this is right, and I will use every last power I have as president to try to get it done. It kind of called a bluff that was, people just assumed, well, this is how we do things, right? We pass these sanctions bills, and and he was like, no, you're gonna have to have a public argument. You're gonna have to win a public argument with me about whether that's the right thing to do, and it was incredibly motivating to work for him, because it was like, a little daunting, but at the same time, doing something that flies in the face of how things are done, it makes it much more interesting to come to work. And it essentially kind of surfaced the underlying issue, because the underlying issue is, if we always have to pass a sanctions bill, the underlying issue is we always have to be in conflict with Iran, which leads all the way, frankly, to confrontation. And so what was interesting about that respect is, I don't know, public opinion was kind of split, but certainly opinion in this city wasn't. I mean, people were very skeptical of the Iran negotiations and very pro-sanctions. And what was interesting is seeing what happens when the president essentially kind of calls that bluff, and suddenly everybody has to kind of show their cards. And every time we did that on Iran, nobody really was confident that they had a winning hand against them.
But on the flip side of this, right? How does it impact the negotiation side, right, in this equation, when you've got political leaders on the opposite side here being very loud, being very vocal, right? They're coming at you on Iran, domestic political opponents coming at you on Iran before you've finalized the negotiations with the Iranians, right? Or Cuba, or whatever the issue is. When domestic politics starts to flame up, how does that impact what you guys are doing on the international side?
Well, I think it cuts both ways. Some people could make the argument that, well, there's a bad cop dynamic where, they know we've got some hardliners, just like, every country does, and so therefore that puts pressure on them. But also, it cuts the other way, in which they're thinking, like, can these people live up to any commitments, and can they follow through on what we're trying to negotiate? I see my role in sometimes akin to, it's a funny thing for someone to say who's like, short and, not, but I'm like the blocking, like, if Wendy Sherman was the running back in the Iran negotiations, I'm just trying to give her the space, like, you shouldn't have to worry, Wendy, about all this stuff back home, Congress and, the media churn on this. So some of my role in this job is to try to give the diplomats the space to just do their jobs and not have to worry about it. And I actually remember literally being in discussions with all of us and saying, you guys think about the nuclear, like, don't be negotiating with Congress at the same time that you're negotiating, with the P5+1, we'll be thinking all that through, and because the risk is that they don't feel the freedom to actually get the deal done, because they have 500 voices in their heads. So part of this is absorbing some of that, and that's part of what a White House has to do.
Hi, I'm Ross Hollister. I'm a graduate at the School of Foreign Service. First of all, I just wanted to express my appreciation for the State of the Union address. I thought that was a great speech. My question actually is related to a foreign policy issue that didn't come up in this speech, which is the United States intervention in Libya. I was curious if you could situate the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi within the larger context of Obama's foreign policy. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's there are many things that converge there. One is, that actually is like the clearest instance of a humanitarian intervention that we've done, in that, the impulse behind intervening really was one of humanitarian concern for civilian populations that we saw at great risk, coupled with essentially the credibility of the international community, which had been, enshrined within a UN Security Council resolution, essentially calling on that behavior to stop. If essentially Gaddafi ignores that, there's a huge humanitarian consequence for the people who are endangered in places like Benghazi and Misrata and other places. And essentially the international community's just, seen its word proved to be totally hollow. Situating it inside situating the context of our entire foreign policy, one, from a humanitarian intervention standpoint, it achieved the finite objective of stopping and averting a humanitarian catastrophe in the case of Gaddafi's forces slaughtering these citizens of Libya on the ground. In the context of the wider turmoil in the Arab world, it essentially led to Libya being more of a vacuum than it was before, because Libya had essentially been hollowed out. There was not like a government in waiting or a long-standing civil society or a history of institutions that were prepared to take the place of Gaddafi once he was gone. So essentially, once the intervention resulted in Gaddafi's demise, you had the humanitarian benefit of having saved a lot of lives, but then you had an enormous political and security vacuum because there was not a governing structure that was ready to take his place. I think when we look back on that, what's difficult to wrestle with is, what could we have done differently to prevent the situation we have today, whereas you have this vacuum in Libya, you have these warring factions, you have a breakdown in security in many different places. And I think that, I think we presumed that the governing structure that we were interacting with, the TNC, was more connected than they were to people on the ground. In other words, you had technocrats who were saying and doing the right things as it related to setting up a new government and pledging to be inclusive, interacting with foreign countries, but they were not able to essentially control the militias that were holding territory in different parts of Libya. So you never connected a political structure to the security challenge. And then two, in that circumstance, what do? We had a program with the Europeans that was going to be focused on kind of training security forces and demobilizing militias. But absent that political entry point, that never really took off. Now, in Washington, this is often framed as, well, we should have gone in heavier in Libya, but the challenge is the Libyans didn't want us there. The only thing that they agreed on is they didn't want any foreigners there. We had to fight just to get like a UN office there. So I think it points to, if you in the context of the Obama, the arc of it, it demonstrates that the United States can bring together the world and accomplish something in very quick period of time, in the way in which that intervention was set up, that saved a lot of lives and that showed the international community can do these things. On the other hand, it's been part of this broader trend across the region where you see that there's an erosion of the authority vested in the establishment, but there's nothing ready to take the place of that establishment. And that's essentially, we're dealing with that in different iterations in many different countries. It's certainly, as you look at Syria, causes you to, again, question, if we went into Syria militarily, would that improve the situation, or would it not?
And we have about 10 minutes, a little bit longer. As we
Yeah, I'll
look
try to
at
keep
the
my answers
queue
brief.
here.
So.
All right, my question will be brief. My name is Andrew Bowling. I'm a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service, and my question is a bit less technical. Given your relationship with the president over the last 8 years, what is something that you most admire about Barack Obama?
I think what I most admire is he's willing to take risks. I mean, it's a version of things I've said a couple times, but I remember I was talking to him after the first meeting he had with Raul Castro in Panama. And that whole thing had gone well because it wasn't just Cuba, like the whole hemisphere was so welcoming of this, and you could see that we'd kind of broken this, through this, seal that had kind of put the United States in one place in the hemisphere for decades, and now we're having a different conversation. And he said something along the line. He was very generous. He's always very generous to his staff, and thanking us for you guys should be proud of this. And I said to him, I said, look, anybody could. Did I do the negotiations with Cuba? Yes. Anybody could talk to these guys. It takes a president to say, I'm going to open relations with Cuba. I mean, like that. He is willing to, again, challenge convention and do things. The only reason, no rational person, I think, would look at our Cuba policy and think that that made sense and was worth continuing. But you just don't do that. You don't change. That's the third rail. You don't touch Cuba policy because that's always been that way. And there's some people who will be really mad if you do that. And time and again, he's been willing on it's true on other issues, but just on foreign policy. The things that we've done or many of the things we've done that I'm most proud of are things where he's been willing to take a risk that flew in the face of the kind of conventional political approach in Washington. You don't do a nuclear deal with Iran. You just keep ratcheting up the sanctions until what? You don't open to Cuba. You wait until the Castros die, and then what? You certainly don't, in the course of one weekend, kind of have all this transaction with the Iranian government. He's willing to take criticism, and I think people, are, they're kind of pricing that in, but that's rare. And I think when you look back at the totality of all the things that have happened, foreign and domestic, a lot of them are things that would only happen if you have a president who's willing to be criticized or take risks or do things that are different than the way they've always been done. And that's what I most admire.
Thank you. My name is Stefania, and I'm a graduate student in the School of Foreign Service. I wanted to ask you about your work with the president as a speechwriter. And as we all know, the president can write very well in his own name, and his speeches have a certain narrative and a story behind that do not limit to a single sentence within the speech. So how do you strike that balance between telling the story and also getting the policy message across? So how do you personalize foreign policy in your own words, as you mentioned before?
Yeah. So it's interesting. He's usually more interested in the story than anything else, because he knows that when we're giving a speech about in Africa, right? Well, that's not just kind of like a set of development policies. There's a whole story behind that in terms of the history of the country we're in, the place of that country in terms of its stage of development, its intersection with the United States. He's usually more interested in a speech at trying to kind of surface the underlying tensions or issues that inform the policy issue than just saying, here's my 9-point plan for X, because that's kind of how his mind works. So the first challenge, I guess I'd say, is that how do you maintain that thread of speaking about things in a way that tells the story? I mean, most Barack Obama speeches have a normal arc. Here's how we got to where we are. Here's what the situation is, and then here's what we should do about it. So by the time he gets to the plan, he's already kind of described the circumstances and hopefully created a logic that makes the policy prescription seem inevitable. Because if you have a certain view of how we got to where we are and where we are, if you've done that persuasively enough, our policy prescription should make a lot of sense. That's the quick answer I'd give. The one issue I'd highlight is terrorism, where he is resistant. He could go out and beat his chest. He has enough of a record to do it when it comes to counterterrorism. But I think he also is of the view that presidential rhetoric creates its own logic and momentum towards policy outcomes. And so if you are, we've been in this controversial space, and he said in the State of the Union that ISIL is a very serious threat. It's an enormous threat, obviously, to the people who they are terrorizing, killing, and it's a threat to our people. But it's not an existential threat to our nation in the sense that they don't risk the destruction of America in the way that the Soviet Union did. That's a controversial statement. But the point is that if we declare this as World War III, the logic of that is we should have tens of thousands of troops in Syria. So, and so you have when you're actually president, you have to think through. If I start describing something in these terms, what is the practical step that would lead from that? That would follow from that. And so that's I think a very that's a balance that he aims to strike, and it can be challenging to at the same time make sure that you are effectively describing what is the biggest threat to the United States of America, but not doing so in a way that creates a logic that extends beyond what we think the right response is. And again, the rhetoric of World War III and the threat to the existence of the United States, he believes enough in the power of language to think that if we're describing it that way, then we would be doing something differently than we're doing in response.
Hi, thank you. My name is MJ Crawford, and I'm a graduate student here and also a fellow at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. Of course, the Obama administration has been duly praised for having a diverse administration and also its staff. And personally, I've seen the complete benefits of having racial, ethnic, and gender diversity at work, and having different backgrounds leading to different perspectives, which leads to greater policy innovation. And I was wondering if you could give an example of a time where maybe there was a policy innovation or idea that really was the product directly of diversity in the office and the people around the table. Thanks.
Let's say a couple of things. First of all, and I'm not saying this to be glib, I have learned a lot from President Obama because of his own diversity. And I'm going to give a different example than that because that's too easy. But literally, when it comes to the window into Africa or Southeast Asia, places that he knows very well, in Africa, for instance, he is, in all of his speeches, from the moment I went to work for him, he's always coming again and again to the issue of corruption and the visceral kind of loathing of corruption that is a part of daily life in Africa. And you should see the audience response when he's in Kenya or in Ghana when he raises these issues. It is like he is tapping into something that people have pent up. And so I've kind of that's an example of the president kind of leading me to understand something that I wouldn't have otherwise understood because of his own diversity. In the administration itself, I think that I have a number of Muslim American colleagues, and one of the things that I think any of us hear from Muslim American friends or colleagues is when the only context in which we're talking to people is security, that in a way you're diminishing the community to just being a security concern. So we raise the security issues, but I think we're always very clear that, that part of this is it doesn't make any sense to stick to, you're doing ISIL's work for them if you portray this as a war between the United States and Islam. But part of this is also we have a very successful, resilient, diverse Muslim American community that is thriving in different fields. And they need to be not, again, in the language. So the language in the State of the Union, I think, is informed by our colleagues who are Muslim Americans who've told us about how the community feels stigmatized. So that's one very clear example, because it would be, and I, by the way, I'd encourage it regionally, ethnically, because you're going to take messaging, alone. You're going to be much better at communicating to an audience if you know what that audience thinks. This is something I learned from political campaigns. When I came into office, the U.S. government does a lot of analysis of foreign publics, and what do they think? What do they think about terrorism? What do they think about nuclear weapons? Well, I asked them, because you have the ability to kind of do your own research, what do they want to work with the United States government on? What do these people actually care about? Because if you're going to Iowa, you wouldn't say, I want to talk to these people about these two issues over and over again. You'd want to know, what do they care about? They care about the farm bill, and they care about ethanol, but we don't do the same thing with foreign audiences. And when you ask the question, well, they care about entrepreneurship and science and technology, and they care about education exchange. And so we developed a whole bunch of programs in our public diplomacy programming that is rooted in entrepreneurship and outreach to young people and science and technological exchange, because it gives us a place and a way to have a conversation with people and to build networks with people that goes beyond just simply talking to them about nuclear proliferation and terrorism, which we have to talk about because we're the United States of America. So some of this is diversity in our own government, and some of this is thinking through from a messaging perspective, who am I talking to? And how are they looking at the United States, and what are they interested in doing with us? And that's something I think we can do more of.
I think we are just about out of time. Do you want Barbara to just take one last, or maybe we could have
people in line fight it out, or just go with the person who's first in line, since he seems to be larger than everyone else too.
I'll be quick. Luis Ponce from Puerto Rico, an SFS alumni. Many of my countrymen in this last State of the Union address were hoping that Obama was going to talk about the economic hardships Puerto Rico is facing, especially because, as you have said, Obama's administrations broke the deal with Cuba, so the U.S. policy towards the Caribbean is also changing. And the Cuba policy has always been tied to Puerto Rican policy, hoping that Obama will be a difference because of his uniqueness. And just recently, beginning this year, the Supreme Court voted to accept two landmark cases about Puerto Rican bankruptcy law and its relationship with the United States. So my question is, was Puerto Rico ever discussing being included in the State of the Union address? Why, if it was, why was it taken out? Or if you could just share your thoughts about this issue?
maybe we can just take the other two questions also, and then you can just sort of divide up. That way everyone has a chance.
Quick.
Very quickly.
Sorry. I was wondering what the greatest experience was working at the White House.
The last one.
Hi, my name is Dongwon Kim, and first year Asian Studies program at School of Foreign Service, and I just want to, given the fact that there is no mentions of North Korea for today, so I just want to bring up briefly, and what should be the next step for the United States and allies and partners in the region, and do you think the policy of the strategic patience is going to be also viable options or policy for North Korea for next administration? Thank you.
So
Thank you both.
And I can do that quickly. Puerto Rico, and again, I don't work directly on that issue. I think in the context of this State of the Union, the president did set out to have this be a different State of the Union. I think in previous years, he probably would have dealt with Puerto Rico in the State of the Union, but he did not want to give a traditional kind of set of policy proposals and responses to policy issues. Because it's his last one, he wanted to step back and kind of address these big themes that get at kind of the direction of the country generally. And so that makes it harder to pull very important issues. I mean, and they're very important issues. One the president talked about all the time, My Brother's Keeper, his initiative with young African American men wasn't in the State of the Union, but because this was a thematic treatment of what are these big things we have to get right. Puerto Rico is clearly a very important policy issue, but frankly, I think that was more a symptom of just the nature of how this was a different State of the Union, and you didn't find a lot of policy in it, and even specific issues, but more thematic. Korea, I'll do North Korea next. I think that the strategic patience point is made as if there's an alternative that is going to make them denuclearize in a near-term time frame. And this is another one of these issues where, it just is the case that, we're not going to precipitate like a conflict on the Korean Peninsula. So then any policy response is calibrating the mix of what diplomatic and economic pressure can we apply on North Korea? How can we work with China to apply more pressure on North Korea because that's its principal lifeline? How can we align our own capabilities in terms of missile defense and our posture in Northeast Asia so that we're best prepared to protect our allies and our own territory? So this is an area where the effective, there are a range of tools that we have to try to apply pressure and create openings with the North Koreans. And it's really the calibration of those tools. And, part of what we can get right is, we've encouraged Japan and South Korea to work more collaboratively with one another as well as us. I think we've made progress on that recently. We'd like the Chinese to apply more pressure. I think there's more that they can do vis-a-vis the North Koreans. But again, I think anybody who tells you that there's a quick solution to this issue is not confronting the reality that this is something where we're just going to have to set the table, apply the pressure, create the off-ramps for North Korea, and take care of our own defense capabilities in Northeast Asia, precisely because of the level of threat that it poses. And lastly, in terms of moments best moments in the White House. I mean, it's hard to point to one. For me personally, Cuba was a particular high point just because I had worked on it for a long time, and all these things had to kind of come together on December 17th. We had to last year we had to do or 2 years ago we had to do a prisoner exchange. We had to announce a coordinated announcement of the normalization of relations. The Cubans had to release other prisoners and take some other steps. We had to take, part of what made that meaningful to me, and this is a good note to end on, is, I heard in the coming weeks from people who would say, I never thought that I would want to. One person, told me that they never wanted to. They were kind of hardline on Cuba issues, and then they went to Cuba for the first time after our announcement, and they didn't know how they were going to feel. It's a Cuban American, and this person told me that he felt completely at peace. Like he felt like something had reconciled for him. And I've heard from individual Cubans to say that this changed their future. They had a kind of ceiling that they saw in their future that had changed. And the point is that they're individual people's lives who are tied up in all this. I talked to Amir Hekmati's sister, and she, sitting and looking at me with tears in her eyes in the White House, describing her twin brother. We have these debates in Washington as if there's like a football game going on, and or this is some exercise in who can sound the best on the news. But like there are individual lives underneath all of these debates and all these decisions. And the things that have given me the most satisfaction when you realize it's something that the president has done has made somebody's life better.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you for being so very generous with this, with our audience this afternoon. And thank you for your service.
Thank you.